When you watch a video on YouTube, you are given a slew of videos to watch that are recommended to you. Most importantly, when you finish a video, one auto plays out of the recommendations. Now, this is fantastic if you're listening to music. You end up getting exposed to all sorts of new and interesting music. But what happens when you're listening to political commentary, when you're listening to so-called news? Recommendation engines and autoplay features are designed to encourage you to continue to engage with a given service. The algorithms are constantly, quote-unquote, improved to maximize that outcome of engagement. The designers of these systems don't actually pay attention to the content. They pay attention to signals that are available to try to determine what makes something relevant from one person to another. So, if someone watches video A and then watches video B, or better yet, actively comments on both, or likes, or forwards, or does a whole variety of other things, the next person to watch video A will then be likely to be recommended video B. Pretty simple, right? Now, of course, what you can probably gather by now is that that's something that can be exploited. That is something that the news community doesn't think to actually make those connections. They put up the videos, they leave the videos there, but this is something that quickly gets exploited. So consider what happens if you're searching for vaccination information on YouTube. Right? The first content you almost always get is actually high-quality video content. The Center for Disease Control, local health organizations explaining the conspiracy around anti-vaccination culture. They produce really responsible videos that, let's be honest, are a bit dry, but they're actually really well produced and informative. But the conspiratorial anti-vax community is hell-bent on getting their message of doubt into this environment to parents who might be wavering, who might be beginning to search to begin with. So many search engines have to struggle with the sophisticated SEO that these groups start to engage in. Now, YouTube has a different problem. If you watch a health organization's video and then follow the recommended video or do the autoplay, within 2 videos you will almost always be watching a conspiracy video. Why? Because the communities who are trying to shape these connections understand that comments matter. So within the anti-vaccine community, there's concerted effort to actually comment on both sites. They help shape the links, they make connections, they bridge things together outside of YouTube and bring them back together. They know that views matter, and they actually shape that connection. And you can build that connection between CDC and anti-vaccine communities in a way that actually is really concerted and cultivated to build that connection. And the result is that anybody who's searching is going to see that connection being made because the work done by YouTube doesn't actually see it as a topic. They see it as a set of signals. Now, my colleague Becca Lewis described another method to influence news content in her report, called alternative influence. While the CDC will never host an anti-vaxxer into a debate about vaccination, many people in the political context think it's appropriate to create a form of false equivalency and have 2 people debating. This occurs on mainstream news, but it also occurs in YouTube. How it plays out in YouTube, though, really matters. Because mainstream commenters who host extremists in order to debate will actually send a signal to YouTube through that process that these 2 videos should be linked. So that the next people who are watching the mainstream viewer will likely be recommended to the extremist views that are coming out. Right? This is a way of creating a pathway and a connection. It's a way of manipulating the actual network graph of these systems. So you end up going to YouTube for reasonably informed information, and within a few places, you are exposed to a lot of extremist content. Now, when people first hear about this dynamic, they immediately say, let's remove this content. And I really get that impulse, right? I am not a fan of the anti-vax dynamic at all. And there's a lot of hateful and conspiratorial content, and I have sympathy for trying to get rid of all of it. But there's a problem as you start to think about where this goes in the long term. Now, YouTube has gotten rid of a lot of content, it's downweighted other content, and there's a lot more that's terrible. But what's interesting is how creators who have an agenda, like is seen in the anti-vaccine communities, actually know how to skirt a line. Right? After all, anti-vax content doesn't tell you that vaccinations are dangerous. They invite you to question and doubt it. Right? That's the process, is to see doubt, to ask you to question whether or not they're safe. And that's much harder to talk about whether we talk about removal. Also, we have a challenge of how the edges are of content that is 100% in a sort of particular political ideology, but may not be extremist. How many of you watch PragerU videos? How many of you are familiar with PragerU videos? Wow, I actually expected to have a lot more of you considering the range of places you come from. PragerU is produced by Dennis Prager, a conservative talk show host. They produce a video a week, and their goal is to undo the quote-unquote leftist messages produced by universities. Their videos are popular on YouTube, but they're especially popular on Facebook. Their CEO claims that 1/3 of all US Facebook users watched a PragerU video on Facebook. Now that's really significant because if you talk to people who are teaching in universities right now, they're constantly now getting questions that come from watching PragerU. Now, they exploit the data void structure on YouTube in order to get people to doubt normative views. They don't necessarily send hateful messages. They just get you to see doubt. So if you're a teenager who's been first exposed to the term, say, social justice, you read it in some history book or whatever, and you throw it into YouTube, you won't get a conversation about the history of the term social justice or the different movements that are involved in it. You will get a PragerU video telling you that this term is a propagandist term that is actually not really meant to help you, but is actually meant to harm you. And it's done because, it works because racial justice movements have left behind the term social justice. So they're no longer producing new content related to it. Now, implicit in their message is a specific idea of you. That you in their message is typically Christian and it's typically white. Now, once you watch one PragerU video, you will be given a non-stop stream of them because there are hundreds of them. So perhaps you will actually get the video called Why No One Trusts the Mainstream News, which undoes a lot of the projects of the people in this room. Or perhaps you will get the video on what they haven't told you about climate change. Now let's check that one out for a second. YouTube recognizes it's in contested territory, so it produces Wikipedia. This is the problem with how they put Wikipedia. But the question is how they got to that phrase, right? Because they didn't put climate change, the Wikipedia entry on climate change. They put the Wikipedia entry on global warming, another left behind term. So you click on that or you search for global warming, which is a reasonable thing to do on YouTube, and what's the first thing that you get? Hoax videos, right? Climate change denial videos. And you're through these paths over and over again. But the difficulty with these paths is that most of them are not total disinformation. They are actually just doubting the current ways of thinking. They are inviting you to question, to see doubt, to look for more information, to do your research. Right? And that is a very familiar campaign. In fact, Russia Today had a brilliant and long-standing campaign called Question More. Right? And so when YouTube is actually called out for, or sued in many cases, for removing content that is deemed to be conspiratorial, which they are, that is often charged of censorship. Right? That's how they sort of push back. The same thing actually occurred with Russia Today, right? Because when they put these posters around, right, the idea is climate change more science fiction than science fact, and inviting you to actually question more, to consume all sides of the news. They put these up, and the UK responded by removing them. And of course, what that meant is RT put up ads saying, this is what happens, right? Redacted censorship. Now, I'm not convinced that actually removing this content gets us anywhere. It just creates different kinds of polarization. Do I believe some content needs to go? Absolutely. But I think we need to think about where the power in this dynamic goes. Right, the power in this dynamic is about taking you from a place of curiosity into a place of extremism. And how do we understand that link? I actually think there's another way to approach this, and I'm personally fond of the approach Spotify uses. So I don't know how many of you use Spotify, but you know when you start to listen to something and you're like in a groove and then suddenly you're interrupted and you're like, not that, right? That's a terrible thing. Well, there's certain things that are known to be massive disruptions. So no matter how much you might like Mariah Carey and you're grooving to We Belong Together, there is a decent chance that you don't want All I Want for Christmas Is You, right? Because if you're really listening to like Mariah Carey's latest hits or long-standing, aura, you don't necessarily want her Christmas album, right? Christmas albums are a distraction unless you're already in the Christmas album thing, right? Because once you're in the Christmas album thing, all you want is Christmas music, right? So it's understood as like a separate universe. Same, by the way, with kids' music, right? You might like They Might Be Giants, but you don't want their kids' album unless you're already there. Now, the way that they deal with that is that they create structures to say that one path should not lead to another. And how do you actually understand that? That requires being aware of content. That requires really understanding context. And that requires actually operationalizing a theory of power into the technology itself.